Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, I may have mentioned this to you already, but apropos of today's topic, I want to run this idea by you. I'm not sure if this is true in Seattle, but in New York, it's kind of a parlor game among liberals to name the first bill that will be passed by the Republicans if they retake the House of Representatives. And it's a source of a lot of humor among my friends and family and I. And I have a nominee for what the first bill passed by the Republican House of Representatives will be if this country is unlucky enough to flip the House in November. You want to hear it?
Sure, lay it on me.
The Unborn Child Gun Freedom Act, which will extend open carry privileges to fetuses in utero. What do you think?
That seems like a compelling choice. I would imagine that they'd be excited about that, the base. My other possibility would be the Make America White Again Act, which is to roll voting rights back to white male property holders who have a certain amount of money in the bank.
That's another good one. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's going to be one or the other, let's say.
Yeah.
But I jest a bit. Actually, I think that's almost a plausible bill, both of those bills, given the composition of the Republican Party these days. But really, that's my witty way of segueing into today's topic, which is gun control. I think I asked you at the end of the last episode the simple question, why can't we control guns in America? And I said at the time that I think I suspect the answer is a lot deeper than just structural issues or political intractability, the NRA's power over our politics. I think there's a deeper answer in there. So I sent you off to figure out whether there's anything in my hunch. And I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about this.
So as always, thank you for the question, Joe. It's a very big question and one that keeps coming around every time there's a mass shooting or a massacre at a school. Why is it so hard to pass sensible gun control legislation?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it should be that difficult because in principle, at least, a large majority of Americans are in favor of certain restrictions on the purchase or possession of firearms. According to a recent survey, 81% of Americans support background checks for those seeking to purchase firearms, 63% support a ban on all assault weapons, and 64% support a ban on high-capacity ammo magazines. This support in principle even passes across party lines, since even Republican gun owners support background checks. Politics, though, gets in the way, as it often does. I can remember when the National Rifle Association seemed like an unstoppable force, its lobbyists stalking the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., and making sure that no restrictions on gun ownership would be passed. The NRA's best days may be in the past. It's currently embroiled in a series of internal scandals. And in recent years, polling has indicated that only 8% of Americans rank gun rights as their top issue, which many take as a sign of the NRA's dwindling influence.
Yes. One of the things I would have said up until quite recently was that NRA supporters seem to be single-issue voters, and that might be one reason why the NRA's point of view has been so difficult to upset.
Right. And even today, the NRA is hardly powerless. It still exerts, for instance, a significant effect on which Republican candidates are able to make it out of their primaries.
Right.
And that has repercussions at the national level because of something we already discussed on this podcast. The fact that our founding fathers decided it was a good idea that every state, no matter how big or small, should have the same number of U.S. senators, which ensures that smaller rural states have disproportionate influence at the national level. The 20 states with the lowest rates of gun ownership have more than 2.5 times the population of the 20 states with the highest rates of gun ownership.
Not surprising.
But those two groups of states have exactly the same number of votes in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, brings us to the filibuster, which we covered in episode 27 of this podcast. The filibuster is a formidable obstacle to any gun control legislation because Republicans and Democrats remain sharply divided on the question of guns. 44% of Republicans say they personally own a gun, compared to only 20% of Democrats. And while 73% of Democrats see gun violence as a big problem, only 18% of Republicans feel the same way. There are more Republicans today who think that gun laws should be less strict than they are now. 27% feel that way, than those who think they should be stricter. Only 20%.
God.
Given that fact, it's remarkable that a piece of gun control legislation did actually just pass the Senate. In June, the Safer Communities Act made it to Joe Biden's desk, where he signed it into law. This bipartisan bill made changes to our mental health system, created some school safety programs, extended background checks for anyone under the age of 21 who wants to buy a gun, assigned funding to some crisis intervention programs, further criminalized arms trafficking, and partially closed the so-called boyfriend loophole, which is to say, there were already laws on the books to restrict access to guns by physically abusive men with previous convictions or restraining orders, but those laws were written to apply only to husbands who threatened their wives. The new law extends that to include unmarried men with a record of menacing their girlfriends. So that's better than nothing, but it does seem like a fairly limited set of restrictions on gun ownership.
Yes.
It doesn't, for instance, ban assault weapons or high-capacity magazines. And you might possibly disagree, but the law feels to me like a set of common-sense measures that will do some good here and there, but won't have much of an impact on gun violence in the country.
I agree completely with that.
Okay, so getting back to why real gun control is so difficult, what we see in Congress is not actually our biggest problem when it comes to guns. The real problem is that more people are buying guns than ever before. In December of 2021, there were an estimated 436 million firearms held by civilians in the U.S. 436 million, and the current number is undoubtedly higher.
How many Americans are there? 330 million or thereabouts, right?
Right.
So it's more than one gun per person.
Right. 40% of U.S. adults report that they live in a household with a gun, and 30% personally own one. Overall, attitudes on the issue of gun control are very polarized. The country as a whole is just about evenly divided, but 93% of Democrats versus only 10% of Republicans supports aggressive gun control legislation. Self-described independents are mostly opposed. Only 45% supports significant gun control. Statistically speaking, the most likely person to support gun control is a black woman, while the most likely person to oppose it is, like you and me, Joe, a white man.
Mm-hmm.
Nationally, we are split into three camps of roughly the same size. 34% of Americans say that if more people owned guns, there would be more crime. 31% say there would be less crime, and 34% say there would be no difference at all. Am I correct in assuming you're not a gun owner, Joe?
That's correct.
Yeah, I also do not own a gun. The closest I've come was a BB gun I got as a Christmas present from my father when I was in my early teens.
Yeah.
My parents had already split up by then, and I remember my mother being pretty unhappy with that gift. So I think she was happier that after a few rounds of target shooting with a rifle, I ran through the set of air canisters that came with it and never bought any replacements. The BB gun went into my closet and was never used again.
Yeah, I actually have a similar story, but not involving a BB gun. My father had a hunting rifle because before I was born, he would go out varmint hunting occasionally. And that rifle was kept in a closet away from the kids. And my mother did not like that at all. And she forbade us from even looking at it. So it was like this mystical object put away in a closet that I don't think I ever laid eyes on, or I don't remember ever laying eyes on. And yet it was there in the home.
Wow.
So it kind of scared me. I think I grew up afraid of guns as a result.
That's interesting. Personally, I can't imagine that I'll ever own a gun, but there are apparently lots of people like you and me who can. In one study, more than 1/3 of Americans who do not currently own a gun said they could envision owning one in the future. So I think it's pretty clear that Americans are ambivalent about guns. Like I said, I've spent my entire life far away from guns. Except for movies, television, and video games, I've pretty much only seen guns in the holsters of police officers.
Me too.
The fact that I personally will probably never own a gun makes me curious about people who do. what is it that creates that difference in perspective? And what can we say about gun owners as a group? First off, studies have shown that one major factor governing your attitude towards guns is whether you were socialized to them. That is to say, whether your father took you out hunting when you were a kid, rather than locking his hunting rifle in a closet that you were never allowed to look at.
Right.
Whether you grew up surrounded by people who own guns, and whether your friends and family own guns today. Now, if you haven't already guessed, my answers to those questions are no, no, and no.
Right. Same here.
That social exposure strongly affects your attitude towards guns. My attitude is shaped by the fact that I have no personal connection with gun owners, so I mostly hear about guns when someone is in the news because he shot somebody. My brain has been trained to directly connect guns with violence because that's the context within which guns show up in the news and information that I consume. If you have a happy memory of your father teaching you how to clean a rifle, though, or if you've had fun at the shooting range with friends, you're likely to have a different set of associations. Non-gun owners like me tend to believe that access to firearms is one of the primary reasons that mass shootings happen. If, though, you have lots of friends and family who own guns, and none of them have committed murder, then it might seem self-evident that access to guns is not the reason that violence occurs. It's also true that how you feel about guns depends a lot on where you live. 41% of Americans living in rural areas own a gun, but only 20% of city dwellers do. And 65% of city dwellers think gun violence is a big problem, while only 35% of rural residents agree. A majority of Republicans, 54%, live in a household with a gun, while only 31% of Democrats do, but a whopping 71% of rural Republicans are in favor of teachers and school officials carrying guns in K-12 schools. And while 51% of Republicans who live in urban communities favor a ban on assault weapons, only 31% of rural Republicans support such a ban. This effect is felt among Democrats as well. Only 21% of urban Democrats support arming elementary school teachers, but that number rises to 33% among rural Democrats. And while we might assume that these rural pro-gun numbers mostly represent the perspective of sport hunters, the number one reason gun owners give for purchasing a gun is not recreation, it's protection. 59% of gun owners say that their firearms make them feel safe, and 63% cite personal safety as the primary reason they own a gun. Multiple studies have shown that gun ownership is rooted in fear of victimization. The decision to buy a gun is largely motivated either by the memory of being victimized in the past or the fear that you will be victimized in the future. This is generally true of all gun ownership, but is particularly true of handgun ownership. Fear of crime is strongly correlated with gun ownership, and the fear doesn't need to be rooted in actual events. The simple perception that the world is a dangerous, violent place is enough to motivate the purchase of a gun. One interesting fact, though, the largest demographic of gun owners in the U.S. is white men who live in smaller, rural communities and make more than $100,000 a year. So we're not talking about a vulnerable class here.
Right.
These are people who can afford to live in the nice part of town and install security systems in their home. So they're not buying guns to fight off actual threats. They're buying guns to prepare for anticipated threats.
Right.
The pandemic and the political and social unrest that accompanied it provided us with a good example of how this plays out. In March of 2020, when COVID-19 was first dominating the headlines and it was impossible to find toilet paper in the stores, the U.S. set a new record for monthly gun sales. There was another peak on May 25th of that year when George Floyd was murdered, and sales remained high during the social unrest that followed. Gun retailers surveyed during that period reported that about 40% of their customers were first-time gun buyers. And it wasn't just white people who were buying guns. Joe, you forwarded to me an article talking about how anti-Asian hate crimes during the pandemic, which were stirred up by then-President Trump referring to COVID-19 as, quote, the China virus, unquote,
yes,
convinced many Asian Americans to buy a gun for the first time. Sales to Asian Americans during that period increased by 43%, and more than half of those guns were sold to first-time buyers. According to a study out of the University of Michigan, Asian Americans who experienced or witnessed racism were more likely to buy firearms for self-defense, and their experience of racism didn't need to be actual to affect their behavior. Those who simply experienced stress because they were thinking about the potential for racial violence were also more likely to buy a gun.
Hmm.
All told, more than 5 million people bought a gun for the first time during the pandemic. Those are bad days. The news was full of reports of social unrest, police brutality, and hate crimes. And there's a clear link between media reports of violent incidents and gun sales.
I think that as we get back to normal after the pandemic, and I don't just mean like physical normal where we're not masking in schools anymore and that kind of normal, or not masking in the subway, not social distancing as much, but psychological normal where people don't feel like death is around the corner at all times and they could die, people in their family could die from this mysterious, shadowy virus. I do believe that crime statistics are going to go down, as I think I said in our crime statistics episode, that we need to get back to some semblance of psychological normal in order for people to not be so filled with what you described as this fear of victimization.
I think you're totally right, but I think one of the overarching questions is when we go through something like the pandemic, which is such a personal and social stress, does it leave a residue? Like, is there a buildup over time where we never quite get back to where we were before? Every time gun-related violence hits the news, after the Uvalde school shooting, to cite a recent example, two things happen. On the one hand, public support of gun control will go up. People will demand that politicians do something to stop this from ever happening again. Meanwhile, some people will draw the conclusion that America has become a scary, violent place. They will conclude that they need to protect themselves or their family, and they will decide to purchase a gun. After 2 or 3 weeks, sentiment in favor of gun control generally drops back to previous levels, but all those new guns that were purchased will still be out there in civilian hands. Wait a few weeks for the next outrage-driven news cycle, and the process will repeat. Mass shootings account for just 0.5% of annual U.S. gun fatalities, and they have a negligible impact on long-term political sentiment around gun legislation, but the way they are reported serves to increase the percentage of Americans who own guns. Overall support for gun control has declined over the last few years. In 2019, support for stricter gun laws was at 60% in America. This year, that number is down to 53%. And that decline is across the board. In 2019, 86% of Democrats were in favor of stricter gun laws. In 2022, that percentage has declined to 81%. Still a strong majority, but lower than it was. So we can take it as a given. The number one reason for a person to buy a gun for the first time is fear. But there is no solid evidence that owning a gun decreases that fear. And this might partly explain why gun owners stockpile weapons. Owning their first gun didn't make them feel any better, so they bought a second one, and then a third. The average U.S. gun owner possesses 5 firearms, and 8% own 10 or more.
Oh, that's interesting. Some of it is just the shiny object, too, right? Like owning cars, right? You collect cars, collect guns, collect baseball cards, Start a collection.
There are undoubtedly some collectors out there. But the fact that the average U.S. gun owner owns 5 firearms was a real eye-opener for me.
Yes.
Like I would have assumed that it was random crazy people or collectors who owned multiple guns, but it seems like among gun owners, that's the norm, is that you have more than one.
Yeah.
So let's try to get into the mind of a gun owner. If you believe that you live in a violent society and that your guns are your last line of defense keeping you and your family safe, how will you feel when lawmakers talk about making it harder to get a gun, or possibly even banning guns that you already own? You would probably see that not so much as a threat to your rights, as it's often discussed, but as a threat to your safety. No doubt that's the reason that whenever gun control legislation is in the news, gun sales rise. If the world already has you feeling afraid, and the thing that you believe might save you could go away, you will rush out to buy it while you still have a chance. And it wouldn't be accurate to say that it's just a generic kind of fear that most commonly motivates gun ownership. It's often racially motivated fear. A lot of guns have been sold because white people are afraid of black people. In a 1985 study, the mere proximity of a large black population was enough to motivate white people to purchase guns. Though it's not just white people who buy guns, of course. In 2017, 36% of white Americans reported that they own guns, but also 25% of blacks and 15% of Hispanics. In recent years, gun ownership among non-white groups has risen, in part because the police in some communities have shown themselves to be flagrantly disinterested in protecting blacks and other minorities. So it's kind of a mess. People are afraid. News media regularly tell them that they should be afraid, and increasingly they feel that they have reason to fear not just crime, but also the police, and depending on who's in the White House, maybe even the government as well. But while you're listening to this, you might be asking yourself, what about guns themselves?
Yes.
It's well documented that having a gun in the home greatly increases the likelihood of an accidental shooting or suicide. Why don't gun owners recognize that they're putting themselves and their families at risk by putting a weapon inside their home?
Yes, Mark, that's exactly what I was thinking while you were saying that.
Well, that's where cognitive biases come in, another topic that we've touched on in this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We are biologically predisposed to minimize the risks and magnify the benefits of the things that we choose to do. If you happen to see a YouTube video of someone who accidentally shot himself in the leg while posing with his gun, you're likely to laugh at how dumb that guy is and tell yourself that you'd never be so careless.
Right.
There's something that psychologists call motivated disbelief, which is a close cousin to confirmation bias. If you believe that your gun keeps you safe, you're motivated to disbelieve anything that calls guns into question. And to be fair, that works both ways. People like me who perceive little benefit to gun ownership are also likely to overestimate the risks of having guns in the home. We're all encased within our biases and preconceptions, and it takes a lot of work to get outside of that shell. Most people don't bother to do that work, or it doesn't occur to them to try, and so the two sides of the gun control debate see each other through a distorted lens. We exaggerate the foolishness or the stupidity of the people on the other side of the divide. One side sees no real benefit to guns, but huge risk, while the other sees significant benefit and negligible risk. The first group finds it easy to dismiss so-called gun lovers as violent bigots, while the second group might describe the first as dangerous zealots. And this debate is heightened because this is ultimately a contest of two fears: that people will die because we don't have enough gun control, or that people won't be able to defend themselves because there's too much gun control. When the U.S. Senate is debating a gun control measure, it's a question of whose fear will win the day, and losing that vote will only magnify the fear of the opposing party. So you ask me, Joe, why is gun control so difficult in this country? My answer is this: it's because we're afraid. And the bad news is that there are plenty of sources, news media, movies, and social media, to name three, that are telling us over and over again that the world is a dangerous place full of things that should frighten us. Meanwhile, I don't hear many opposing voices. I can't really think of anyone or anything actively working on the national stage to reduce our fear of crime and violence. So that's my answer to your question. Why is gun control so difficult in this country? It's because too many people are afraid, and too many sources are all too ready to say that they're right to feel that way.
I think you nailed this one, Mark. This is the answer I was looking for. I mean, I had a strong feeling going in that there's something deep going on in the primitive brain vis-a-vis guns, and I couldn't put words to it, but I think you've really articulated it beautifully, and thank you. I think your analysis about the fear of victimization being at the root of all this, the confirmation bias, which I call willful ignorance in a lot of situations, is central to this. And so I agree with your assessment about what's going on inside the brains of gun owners, but I just keep coming back to that side of the argument, the gun owner side, being irrational. It just doesn't square with the facts, with the science, with the statistics. Statistics support how more guns do not equal more safety. You know, I read a few months ago about a California study that said something like, if you don't own a handgun but you live with somebody who does, you're more than twice as likely to die by homicide.
Yeah.
And you're 7 times more likely to be shot and killed by your spouse or your intimate partner if you live in a home that has guns. I mean, these are just facts,
right.
You know? This is not some blue state opinion mongering conspiracy theories. This is not blue state QAnon. These are the facts.
Right.
Published by the CDC and rigorous studies. So the gun owner's brain, you've done a beautiful job of explaining why he or she thinks the way they do. But when confronted with the facts, I just don't understand why that doesn't change behavior and change opinions. Is willful ignorance so strong that you're just not going to accept the truth? That's the part I don't get.
Well, I think what it gets down to is that fundamentally humans are not driven by facts and figures. We're driven by emotion. And emotional arguments are much, much, much more powerful than factual arguments. And this is something which has been a daily part of my professional life as a communicator, is that if you send an array of facts out to people, you are not going to convince people, because we do have the confirmation bias tendency to question a source that is counter to what we believe to be true.
Right.
Like, in a weird way, it reminds me of Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts, running for president against George Bush Sr. And Dukakis was one of those Bill Clinton-style technocrats where he was always ready with a statistical study.
Mm-hmm.
And in debates and in speeches, he was pulling out facts and figures, just proving the points that he was trying to make. And meanwhile, Bush was riding the circuit, talking about 1,000 points of light and, the greatness of the American spirit. And Dukakis got his ass kicked because he put facts up against an emotion, and emotion wins every single time.
Yeah.
So if we are going to come to someone who's motivated by fear with a set of statistics, we are going to lose that argument. What we need to do is find an emotional argument that is more powerful than the fear argument. And the problem is that fear is such a powerful motivator that that's a very high bar to clear.
Yeah, agreed. Well, first of all, the Dukakis reference really resonates with me because I worked on the Dukakis campaign for several months. And I remember cringing during that fateful debate where the question of hypothetical about your wife getting raped was asked to Dukakis and Bush, and Dukakis's answer was absolutely correct on the social science, but absolutely incorrect on the emotion, and the performative value is absolutely the wrong thing to say, and it may have lost him the election. But beyond that, I do agree. I've come to understand now that the political opposition to gun control can be overcome. And the self-immolation of the NRA is part of that process. But overcoming the fear reaction in people that triggers the desire, irrational desire for guns, that's the toughest foe.
Yeah.
That's the battle that we might not be able to win in this country.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of my late mother-in-law, who would watch the news on television at 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and 10 o'clock. Like, she would keep coming back to each edition of the news. And each time the news would be saying, there's a rapist out on the streets, so stay tuned and we'll give you the information you need. Or there's a surge in street crime, or what you can do to keep yourself from being burglarized. And very clearly, the news media were leveraging fear as a way of driving viewership, which is probably great for the station's numbers. But you have to wonder, like, what is the overall effect of that? Like, if you hear that again and again and again, how can you not come out of that thinking, oh my God, I live in a dangerous world where my fear arms me against the dangers that are coming against me? And so, yeah, it's a very high hill to climb.
Yeah.
To get our nation outside of the fear mindset that popular media is constantly telling us to go deeper into.
Yeah.
I think that's actually the biggest problem. It's much bigger than the NRA. There's
that old saw from the NRA about, if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, which they always thought was like the show-stopping argument in their favor. But my reaction to that is, yes, only outlaws and law enforcement should have guns. That's exactly right. you know?
Yeah. Definitely playing on the fear of crime mindset. And I'm sure that they were consciously doing that. But the NRA is just riding that wave. And the wave is fear. And the fear is driven by things that are more basic, which is social media and news media.
Yeah. And I'm now snapped right back into Dukakis versus Bush the Elder and the Willie Horton ad. Do you remember that?
Yes.
The ad about the escaped rapist.
Escaped black man.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, no doubt, no argument from me about fear factor and also the sensationalism of the media. And if it bleeds, it leads. That's all relevant and point well taken about that. But let me hit you with this, Mark. Prior to this taping, I compiled some statistics about gun violence that I would like to share with our audience. But let me start with this one because this is a predicate to a question. U.S. gun homicide rate is 26 times higher than in other high-income countries. So let me be devil's advocate for a second here, Mark. Is it that people in Denmark, people in Sweden, people in Japan don't have confirmation bias? They're not afraid? They don't have fear of victimization? What is it about Americans that makes us so uniquely vulnerable to this fear factor that seemingly the rest of the world doesn't fall victim to this? What's going on?
One of my sources, which I didn't work into the presentation for this week, mentioned you are more likely to buy a gun if lots of other people have guns. Like if that appears to be the level of force that you're dealing with, then you're going to get a gun in order to raise yourself to that level. Like the old saying, you don't want to bring a knife to a gunfight.
Right.
So I think what we might be looking at is just a snowball effect of guns breed more guns. Guns breed fear of gun violence. And so you get a gun in order to oppose the gun violence. So it's sort of the gun is a magnifier. It's a magnifier of force, and it's also a magnifier of the response that you feel like you will need in the event that you're confronted by it.
Right.
So I think that would be my answer, is that guns breed more guns. And so we started out with a smaller gun problem, and over time has bred a bigger gun problem.
Yeah. Violence begets violence, and guns beget guns. That sounds extremely plausible to me. It is unarguable that the fear reaction in our primitive brain is motivating this, but we need to get over that fear. There's too much at stake here. And these are the statistics I bring. You know, we focus on mass shootings in this country, talk about sensationalism, the constant focus on the mass shootings, but the daily drip, drip, drip of gun violence is far worse than the mass shootings. I have some CDC stats here covering the years 2016 to 2020. Every day in our country, there are 110 people killed and over 200 people wounded by guns.
Yeah.
Firearms are the number one cause of death for American children and teenagers, mostly by way of domestic and family violence at home.
Yeah.
Blacks are 10 times more likely than whites to die of gun homicide. An average of 70 women are shot and killed by their intimate partners every month. Many more women are shot and wounded, but not killed.
Yeah.
3 million children witness gun violence every year. I mean, these numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
We need to get over this fear because guns are killing us. It's obvious.
Oh, yeah. I totally do not dispute that. It strikes me, though, if the problem is that fear motivates the purchase of a gun, then deploying statistics about gun violence, that doesn't seem like it's going to lessen fear. It's more likely going to make people more afraid. If like our solution is to figure out how to make people less afraid, then probably telling them how many people die by gun violence is not the road to go down.
Yeah, you make a good point again, but I'm arguing in favor of us using our cerebrums, you know?
Yeah.
And not the primitive brain. At some point, we're human beings because we're capable of rational thought. We need to engage that part of our brains and overcome the fear.
Well, let's try to lessen the fear of our listeners right now, because then we might have worked them into a lather. Listeners, you are statistically unlikely to die by gun violence. As many casualties as there are, far more people make it through their lives without ever having to face down the wrong side of a gun. So you are okay. You will be okay. Do you think that worked?
No, but good try.
So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did answer my question. I really think you hit this one out of the park, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
And it's a depressing answer. And it's really a seemingly intractable foe we're up against. And the fear in our own amygdalas is what we're up against here. But it needs to be said. We need to talk about this.
Yeah. And if the opposite of fear is love, then maybe the solution is just to love people in your life. Like send some love into the world. Who knows?
Which was our last podcast.
Yes.
Just send all our mansplaining fans right back to the Google machine to look at the prior episode.
Yes. All you need is love, and mansplaining the podcast to remind you that all you need is love.
Right.
So, the two things you need. Okay, are you ready for your question for next time?
Yeah, all I need is a question for next time. So, lay it on me.
Okay, so for me, this question is something that people who I respect and like disagree very strongly on this topic. The topic is charter schools.
Oh.
And for context on this, I used to work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and there were very, very smart people working on U.S. education reform there. And they really liked charter schools because charter schools, unlike public schools, are able to try new things with the curriculum and methodologies. And so there were some really good stories of inner city charter schools that were having dramatically improved educational outcomes for their students. And so I was like, okay, not every charter school is awesome, but this seems like a good idea. It's a place where we can experiment and maybe find better ways of teaching our kids. And then there was just this wave of this consensus among progressives and progressive sources that I read that charter schools are evil. They are deeply, deeply evil, funded by billionaires, intended by right-wing cabals to steal money from the public school system, and that charter schools need to be wiped from the face of the earth. So I'm asking you, Joe, what is going on where smart, educated, and progressive people told me not so long ago that charter schools were actually a promising way of reforming education in this country, and yet I also hear that they must be opposed in all forms. What's going on with that? Because otherwise I can't make sense of it.
Yeah, good question, Mark. And I must admit, I have strong feelings about this subject. And this is a rare moment in mansplaining archives where I feel like I know the answer to this question before I even research it.
Wow.
This might be a first for your questions. But in any case, I will get on this, and I'm going to have a nice presentation ready for you on this subject that I care a lot about. So thanks.
Cool.
Okay, folks, if you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, and I hope you have a lot of them, or you want to comment on this episode or any other episode of the podcast, we ask that you go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. That's where you can like us, check our sources, leave a comment or question about what you heard, or suggest topics for future episodes. And Mark and I welcome and appreciate any and all feedback that you want to share with us. We love to grow this audience if possible. The most efficient way to do that also involves you. You can give us a rating. You can write a review on whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. Please do that if you haven't done it yet.
If you're a social media influencer who could send us a tweet,
that would be fantastic.
Talk about us on TikTok.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too dark here, folks, but to paraphrase Lindsey Graham, if you don't support this podcast, there could be riots in the streets. There may be gun violence.
Right. So give people what they need and tell them about Mansplaining the Podcast.
Do your part to remove the scourge of guns from our society by supporting this podcast.
Yes.
But that's about it for this episode. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.